I think economics tries to define how capitalism works, how the market system works. But I don't think that there's one definition of capitalism itself, and I think that that's something that people don't think about enough, particularly in the US. In our politics at the moment, there's very much a misunderstanding, I think, between capitalism and socialism. I mean, for example, Bernie Sanders, when he was a presidential candidate on the left, was often called a socialist. Well, he's a democratic socialist, and in terms of his policies, he's probably pretty close to your average German Christian Democrat. I mean, we're not talking about Russia, in the post 20s here. So I think that there's a real misunderstanding. I think that there are different forms of capitalism. I think the Anglo-American style capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that people, goods, and capital can travel anywhere with no restrictions is one type of capitalism. And through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, it's been spread. And through the power of the US, frankly, economically, it's been spread. But you can look just two other examples. Liberal democratic societies in Europe have very different forms of capitalism. It's a kind of a kinder, you call it what you will, but a free market social democratic system in which there are certain understandings that the state will play an important role. One of my favorite models actually is the sort of the German Mittelstand model, in which you have a kind of a public-private labor interaction that creates, I think, more resiliency in the system. It's almost like when you have a building in which many pieces are put together, it allows both stability and flexibility. Whereas I think the Anglo-American form of capitalism tends to be extremely efficient, but also very brittle. And that's what we're seeing right now, where, great example in the US, post-COVID-19, you had farmers with excess food having to throw it away. And because the supply chains were so rigid that some supply chains only went to restaurants, well, they're closed. Other supply chains went to big groceries, but food couldn't be moved between the two of them. I mean, that's a perfect example of Anglo-American style laissez-faire capitalism that is very efficient, but not at all resilient. And then, of course, you have Chinese state capitalism and emerging market state capitalism, in which the state also has a role, but much more of a guiding role, a kind of a strong industrial policy in which you have major economic policy making decisions really being taken from the top down, and companies really being in service to the national strategy, as opposed to companies being able to move 35,000 feet above national concerns the way you have, in many Western countries. So I think that there are many different forms of capitalism, and I think in some ways, our definitions of which countries have which kinds are changing. I think in the US, we might start to see more state intervention of the type that China has. China actually initially borrowed that model from the US, which was one of the first countries to have an extremely strong industrial policy under Alexander Hamilton. So it's an evolution, and I don't think that there's one definition.